We're joined now by two members of the Bush administration's national security team, former Secretary of Homeland Security Michael Chertoff and former Director of the CIA Michael Hayden. Welcome to both of you.
David.
General Hayden, let me begin with you. Reaction to what you've heard here from Mr. Brennan, specifically on new threats being posed by Yemen and al-Qaeda in Yemen.
No, I agree totally with what John pointed out. We've been watching Yemen for some time. In fact, based on al-Qaeda in the tribal region of Pakistan, we always look to Yemen and Somalia as a place where the senior leadership could flee to. Now, the senior leadership has not gone there, but we have seen a steady growth in al-Qaeda in Yemen since about 2006. If you recall then, David, there was a massive jailbreak in Yemen. About 24 al-Qaeda members that were incarcerated there escaped. And from that point on, where we've seen a steady growth of al-Qaeda and their use of Yemen as a safe haven.
Should there be some accountability on the part of Bush national security officials like yourself at a time when there were detainees from Guantanamo released back to Yemen, at a time when Yemen and al-Qaeda there was becoming more robust, that the administration did not do more to specifically target the al-Qaeda threat?
Oh, we worked very hard on it. As John pointed out, there's a continuum of action between President Bush's administration and President Obama's administration with regard to these national security threats. Now, true to be said that we did release some folks from Guantanamo, despite our best efforts, making this threat assessment, that actually returned to the battlefield to return to terrorism. And certainly we bear responsibility for that.
Is this a new front in the war on terror as you see it, Yemen?
It is a growing front. It is, as John pointed out, it's not all that new. We've seen it coming for some time. It's always been unsettled. And since about 2006, we've seen it take a more prominent role in al-Qaeda's safe havens in ungoverned areas in the world.
Are you concerned if the administration decides to release any additional prisoners from Guantanamo to Yemen?
This is a very difficult question. Each of these have to be decided individually. The only counsel I would offer, as we recognize how difficult this is, we made some mistakes, and I would not be governed by any artificial timeline. I'd take my time with this.
The mistakes being the release of the prisoners? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, exactly. That some people that we decided to release, with our best judgment at the time, have returned to the fight. That should be a cautionary tale for President Obama's administration.
So don't close Guantanamo, is your point.
I would not be in a rush to close Guantanamo, but David, to be fair, we were trying to reduce the population at Guantanamo as quickly and as carefully as we could in the Bush administration.
Secretary Chertoff, so much has been made of failures on the part of this administration. Is the other way to look at this that it has become enormously difficult to pull off an attack against the United States, that what we're seeing are low-level, incompetent people who can't quite pull it off? Is that not a positive sign for U.S. intelligence, for U.S.?
I think that's exactly right, David. I think, as John points out first, to put it in perspective, as troubling as this incident is, we have seen occasion after occasion where we have disrupted plots, and we've batted almost 100%. And I think this plot also demonstrates, because of the complexity and the fact that they had to use a new operative, that they are actually being forced to work under a great deal of pressure and are handicapped in carrying out these plots precisely because we have made it difficult, although not impossible, to smuggle explosives onto airplanes.
What went wrong here?
I think that the review that John's going to undertake is going to be very specific about that. It strikes me that what we're going to look at are two possible areas. One is, was there a failure not to connect the dots in the sense of bringing them together, but to understand the significance of what those dots were? And I think that's an important part of the inquiry. The second piece is, as John pointed out, is there were scanners in the airport in Amsterdam that were not used. Why were they not used? The European Union has banned the use of these devices because of privacy issues, and I think that's going to cause another debate about where we strike the balance between privacy on the one hand and the right to life that every air traveler has when they get on an airplane.
I want to come back to this body scanner issue in just a minute, but I want to press you on this point about both the gathering of intelligence, the sharing of intelligence. Again, the accountability question for Bush administration officials like yourself. The Bush administration created these extra layers of intelligence gathering and dissemination, and yet left office before they were proven to be effective, clearly. We have so many ways to gather intelligence and to look at this intelligence, and yet the government's still not talking to each other.
Well, first I have to say, David, I mean, it was obviously effective during the 7 years that we had after 2001 because we did not have an attack or anything even approaching a successful attack. And frankly, it was successful through most of this year because of the number of plots you've seen disrupted, including Headley, Zazi, the 5 jihadis who went over to Pakistan who've been apprehended. So actually, the real story is the enormous amount of success we have had. But it's not perfect. And I think that This is an occasion to look and see what do we need to do to improve the system, even though I think the architecture is basically sound and has served us well over 8 years.
Let me return to the body scanner issue. As you have pointed out numerous times, and we talked about before, you are a consultant for a company that makes the type of body scanners that you advocate, although it's something that you advocated as Homeland Security Secretary as well. Would they have done the job? Would they have detected the amount of PETN that he had on board?
I believe the answer to that is yes. Of course, no technology is perfect, but this would dramatically increase things that are concealed underneath people's clothing on their bodies. We have known about this problem for years. In 2005, I testified about this before Congress. I said we have got to deploy these kinds of capabilities, otherwise people are going to smuggle in explosives or weapons hidden on parts of their body. I have been through the machine myself. I have looked at the image. I think we have taken steps in the deployments that we have undertaken to protect privacy. At the end of the day, no one has come up with a better solution. And keeping your fingers crossed that the enemy won't figure out this vulnerability is a very foolish way to manage security.
General Hayden, same question I asked John Brennan, which is, are we safer as a country since the immediate aftermath of 9/11?
Absolutely. I mean, as John pointed out, it's not the question that the system broke down. It's a question that the system needs to be improved. We are facing a learning enemy. This is an enemy that adapts, and we have to adapt with that enemy. One case in point, some of the early stories that came out was that the information was not shared, which was the belief that what happened prior to the attacks in September 11, 2001. That is simply not the case. In this incident, this information was shared. It was available. What it was not was not highlighted. It was not connected, and that's a human activity, and that's a very difficult task. And as you pointed out, this becomes easier only in retrospect. In prospect, these are very difficult things to do.
It's interesting, Secretary Chertoff. You were on this program back in 2006, and you touted the government's ability at that time to look for vulnerabilities, to come together as a group and try to outthink the terrorists. And yet, this is what the former Inspector General of Homeland Security had to say in an op-ed in the New York Times this past week. He said, perhaps the biggest lesson for airline security from the recent incident is that we must overcome our tendency to be reactive. We always seem to be at least one step behind the terrorists. Is that the case?
Well, I don't think that's true, and I think, as I say, this was a problem we anticipated, the notion of someone concealing explosives. I also have to point out that the screening failure took place overseas, and that does reflect some issues we have with sharing of information where the Europeans are reluctant because of privacy. I think the problem has been not so much the recognition, but the implementation. There has been an enormous amount of resistance, not just in the issue of technology, but in the issue of secure documentation and other things that we've done, by groups that simply don't believe that we ought to have these security measures. It took us years to get the Western Hemisphere document requirements in place because we had a tremendous amount of political resistance. Right. So I think this is an opportunity to reinvigorate the willpower.
General Hayden, are we effectively ethnically profiling potential suspects who want to hurt the United States?
I'm not quite sure the context in which you're asking the question, David, about ethnically profiling, but with regard to intelligence...
Well, isn't there a profile of who we think the terrorists are?
Right. Of course there is, but it's based more on behavior. I mean, for example, the individual in question here, Abdul Muttalib, I mean, he would not have automatically fit a profile if you were standing next to him in the visa line at Dulles, for example. So it's the behavior that we're attempting to profile, and it's the behavior, these little bits and pieces of information that were in the databases that we didn't quite stitch together at this point in time. But it wasn't a question of ethnicity or religion. Those are contributing factors, but it's what people do that we should be paying attention to.
But I want to press Secretary Chertoff on this point, because I've spoken to counterterror officials and say it's more than a contributing factor. We know who 90% of these terrorists are. There may be other examples of women being used and whatnot, but Islamic males between the age of 20 and 30 make up roughly 90% of that profile. Is that an inappropriate or appropriate way for law enforcement to be targeting individuals?
I think relying on preconceptions or stereotypes is actually kind of misleading and arguably dangerous. Obviously,
so that's wrong. That profile's wrong?
Correct. Well, now what I would say is you want to look at things like where has a person traveled to, where have they spent time, what has their behavior been, but recognize one of the things that Al-Qaeda has done is deliberately try to recruit people who don't fit the stereotype, who are Western in background or appearance. Look at a guy like an Adam Gaddan who grew up in California, who's one of the senior level Al-Qaeda operatives, but does not fit the normal prejudice about what an extremist looks like.